Hello my bookish friends out there in booktube land, and welcome to another episode of Tristan and the Classics. In this episode we're looking at 4 classic books that I read in the month of August, so it's the August reading wrap up. And there was some really good ones amongst these 4, all have their high points and worthiness to consider. So without further ado, let's get stuck in and have a look at them, shall we? The first classic book that I read in the month of August was Arthur Morrison's A Child of the Jago. Now, a couple of months back, I did a video where I had a book haul in which I mentioned this book, but I dived into it this month and thoroughly enjoyed it. William Morrison, not a well-known writer now, but in the 1890s was very well known, particularly for his long hard look at the poor of London, specifically the vicious poor. And I'm not saying that's his term, he had sympathy for them, but I'm using Mr. Bumble from Oliver Twist, who called them the vicious poor. Now, this book is set in a neighbourhood called the Jago. It's one of the neighbourhoods of that blackest pit of London, the East End. And by the way, I don't mean that today, but that's how it was known back then. It's where incalculable human suffering took place. Poverty like you cannot even begin to imagine. The West End, the East End of London had started off sort of well-to-do with merchants, silk merchants, but through what Morrison calls a century of infamy, the East End of London came to be the home, the very claustrophobic home of 1 million poor, impoverished souls. Now, the Jago itself, the East End of London, I might say, you know, that includes places like West Ham and Mile End and Stepney and Bow and Bethnal Green, and then the Nickel, or properly termed the Old Nickel, which was renowned as the poorest place in the east of London. Morrison renames it the Jago, and the whole book just takes place in around 6 streets where the police even generally try not to go. They fear to go because it is so rough. Everybody there lives according to sort of the neighbourhood order. You can't be a snitch on people. You live a violent life. If anyone has a door on their house, because all of the houses at the beginning don't have front doors, loads of people living in the streets outside, some have the odd trinket in their home, you're thought of as pretentious if you have a front door here. If you want to collect some nice things or hang up a bit of wallpaper, then you're putting on airs and graces and people are going to hate you. And there's a great sort of clan divide, sort of gangs have formed within the Jago called the Rands and the Learys, and they frequently set at each other in massive brawls. And I'm not talking here brawls as described by Charles Dickens. We're not talking brawls in a Thackeray sense. We're not talking your generalised kind of brawl which is for a novel. These are really gritty. There's an occasion in this where one of the women, her fighting tactic is known to throw a person to the ground and then bite at the nape of their neck and not let go. And there's a scene in that which, like, you know, makes the blood curdle. Now, I'm not going to say it's grotesquely graphic, because it's not. However, it's so real, and these are drawn on actual experiences and seen by Morrison himself. Now, the story, as it goes, follows a young lad called Dickie Perrott. And he is sort of taken up by the Jago. That's his whole life. He's growing there. And so he longs to be a pickpocket and then maybe even a cosh carrier. That is, you carry a piece of metal, whack someone over the head and rob them. Making money and nicking portable goods from wagons that pass just beyond the Jago. But we follow his life and the way he sees everything uncritically. And that to exist outside of the Jago is nothing to aspire to. Except certain things begin to happen and he begins to sense a chance of becoming something, to actually contribute something, to grow as a character. But he's warned that there's no way out of the Jago. If you come from there, you'll always be seen as one of them. Now, there's some subplots that run around him, such as activities of his father and the fighting and the barbarity. You'll also see the Rands and the Learys come together at some points when they decide that they're going to fight a different neighbourhood called Dove Lane. And you see what goes on between them. Dickie is a bit vicious at times to some of the children near him. One in particular who's disabled, a little disabled, but this one tries to get his own back on Dickie, and you see how this vengeance, this rift, has an effect on his life. There are other characters as well that will make use of young ones in the Jago for their own ends. Mr. Weech, who has a shop that sells stolen goods, and how he brings on young lads, Dickie included, in order to make money from them. And the way this all wraps up is quite tremendous, to be quite honest. Now, I'm going to come back to this book when I talk about books later on, because I want you to remember that people reading this, some of them were reformers who wanted to fix the poor and the condition of the poor, and he talks about some of the institutions that Dickie sometimes pops in to see that's supposed to better humankind. But the overall apathetic attitude to the suffering and the life, as if they're subhuman in the Jago, is something that I want to refer back to when I come across another book which is totally unrelated, and yet, strangely, is that there are two tethered ends that fit one another across the distance of time and society. But that's The Child of the Jago. I highly recommend it. As regards a story, it's nothing phenomenal. Like, the story itself pretty much been repeated a number of times, but for the insight into the working class, not even the working class, the unemployed poor of London back then, and get rid of this idea that everybody in Britain has always had it easy. Some of the worst conditions on the planet were to be found in the East End of London, at the very height of the British Empire. So a very interesting read. I would actually recommend this book. I think you would enjoy it. The second classic book that I read in the month of August was the book we read on my Patreon as a community, and that was The Fabulous, one of the books I recommend most to anyone who says, recommend me a book, The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. This is like one of the best thrillers. This book changed the thriller genre. In some respects, you could say it sort of invented it. It's gothic, but it's where gothic flips over into thriller as we recognise it. You see, Gothic literature, if you haven't seen it, go and watch my video on the 8 aspects of Gothic literature. I'll link it below. Gothic literature is set apart from normal life. A lot takes place in isolation, in unusual surroundings. You've got the Grand Castle in the background. You've got secret prophecies, things that are out of the ordinary. What Wilkie Collins does is he takes the Gothic and brings it to our doorstep. There's the elements of the Gothic in there that can now happen in real life, which can just cross an ordinary person's day-to-day living. There's nothing extraordinary about the characters per se. And almost everyone, I think everyone, there's not a single comment in the comments on Patreon that said they didn't enjoy this book. So many were raving about it and thanking me for recommending it, which is very kind of you. But obviously Wilkie Collins is the one that wrote it. He deserves your thanks. So The Woman in White, it basically tells the story of one Walter Hartwright. Well, it at least starts with him. He's going to get a new job somewhere when on his way home towards London in the middle of the night, someone touches his shoulder in the dark, and he turns around and there's a woman all in white, and she's very fidgety and nervous, and she speaks mysteriously. She's like, will you help me get to London, but when you get there you mustn't follow me. Do you know any people in London? And she's on edge about something, but he takes her, I'm not giving anything away, it's right near the beginning. He takes her to London. She eventually gets in a coach. He wants to make sure she's okay, but she says, you promised you wouldn't follow me, so just leave me. And once the coach goes, he sees 2 other men ride up in another carriage and say to a policeman, have you seen a woman all dressed in white come by? Now, Walter Hartwright doesn't say anything, but he overhears this, and the policeman says, no, sir. He says, well, here's my card. If you do see her, contact me. And he says, what's she supposed to have done? And the man says, done? Why, she's escaped from an insane asylum. Well, imagine, this is like, the book was written in 1860, so the 1860s, to be insane, to be in an asylum, was a pretty terrifying thing for the public at large. And so begins the story where this woman in white Walter Hartwright seems to instinctively know that their lives are going to be intertwined somehow. And you meet some great characters, one particularly impressive bad guy, and as I said in the review of the book in Patreon, he was so revered as a bad guy that all over Victorian Britain people started naming their cats Count Fosco, because he's just got that malevolent, purring badness about him. So that was the second book, Woman in White. If you've not read it and you like a good thriller, this is a must on your classic shelf. You will not only enjoy it, but it stands there as a pivotal moment in the sensationalist genre. Some say this is the book that invented sensationalist literature. The third classic book that I read in the month of August was a beautiful, beautiful biography, or autobiography I should say, by Robert Graves, and it's entitled Goodbye to All That. Robert Graves, a very renowned poet of the early 20th century. You may recognise his name better from the novels I, Claudius and Claudius the God, that follow the lives of the Caesars. This is his autobiography, and wow, it was just so beautifully told. And he also had an extraordinary life. I don't mean extraordinary in that he deliberately went out looking for escapades, but it's extraordinary because his family lineage is quite high class, if you know what I mean. He was plugged into a lot of the recognisable names of history. And you see him cross paths with a lot of them. He crosses paths with Winston Churchill. He meets Siegfried Sassoon, another poet. He meets Lawrence of Arabia. He does a little account, about 3 pages worth, of when Thomas Hardy invited him into his house. This man has met a lot of the movers and shakers at the beginning of the 20s and onwards of Great Britain. And not only that, he details his adventure at a boarding school called Charterhouse. And that was very well told and it's very engaging. But he was called into World War I. He was called up to active service, where he rose to the rank of captain. And the majority of the book is his retelling or recounting of his time in the trenches. And it's not all about the blood and the guts, the bombs and the rifles. It's about the personal relationships. It's about the superstitions of the men. It's about the calm attitude they begin to take towards the war. They go from excited to fight for the king and country to suddenly getting terrified of the war, then being inured to it and learning that not every time you stand up are you going to be shot. But some of the gross things you see, and how most of the men suffered some kind of mental neurasthenia, he calls it, so sort of a mental irregularity, maybe not full breakdown at times, but going that direction, and has a psychological effect. And there are so many brilliant accounts. He recounts how when he goes to join the 2nd Battalion of the Welsh Fusiliers, whom he is trained with, but when he gets to the actual front, they don't put him in with the Welsh Fusiliers because he's, he wasn't a peacetime member of them, so they didn't count him as such. But when he finally gets put into their 2nd Battalion, he talks about the first night that he's placed on no man's land duty, where they are to climb out of the trenches, wriggle underneath the barbed wire, and start scouting for maybe some German patrol groups in no man's land so that they can take them out. Or they've got to go and fix the wire on the trench. Or they're going to crawl all the way across no man's land and start cutting the wire on the German line. And how they fall into, craters, shell craters, and find, when he puts, it's quite horrific, when he reaches out and he says, suddenly I pulled my hand back. He says, because my hand had gone in something horrible, awful. It was a corpse. It had been blown apart. But then also he recounts how there's occasionally conversations between the British and the Germans, back and forth. There's, humanity is shown, but also the inhumanity. One of the things that stood out to me from this book that was very, very moving, and I think everyone should read and consider it for this reason, is how he talked about how everyone back in Britain who never fought, who was never at the front, how they would talk about the war, and they'd talk about it gloriously, and they'd talk with strong opinions, and it really used to drive the soldiers mad. They had never experienced this war, and the soldiers knew it wasn't glorious. The soldiers loved the men who they were with and had formed strong friendships. They had a purpose in fighting, but started very much disrespecting the powers that were behind it all, because these ones would send them to their deaths, but they would never face bullets themselves. In fact, when life goes back to normal, all the millions of men who have died, you find them in poverty. Not the men who have died, the men who have fought and could have died. You find so many beggars and in poverty, whereas those who were at the top and sacrificed everyone for their lives, they've still got all the best parts of life, and you can see the bitterness that's there. However, what's so good about this is Robert Graves tells it in such an offhand, almost blithe way, and it's also it's not acerbic. He's quite tolerant of everybody. He listens to their opinions. He talks about conscientious objectors and how some dislike them, but he never goes that far. He understands why they feel that way. And he sees war as a madness. Something else you find is how many of the soldiers, when they got their medals, either threw them away or wore them on the inside of their coat. When you're supposed to go on a particular ceremony after the war, according to the king's pleasure, you're to wear your medals. And he talks about how a soldier would wear them on the inside of the jacket because they despise the war in the end. And it's a phenomenal, very human tale. But also, he's a poet, and he talks about so many little incidental details, quotes lines of poetry which fit at the time. We get an insight into his way of explaining a person's character, and I don't mean in depth, just little phrases. You see all these characters flicker in and out because, let's face it, loads of them get shot. And you learn about the superstitions, like one of the guys in the trench. Graves tells the story, he says, he had a premonition. He says, and this happened all the time. He just said to one of his men, I'm going to die tomorrow. I'll probably get shot through the head. Here's all my belongings. Please send them back to my family when I die. And I've got these francs here. You can have them. And lo and behold, the very next day, the man got shot straight through the forehead. But it's not told in a story form. It's told, I can't say without passion. It's not dispassionate. But it's not trying to get a rise out of you. It's not doing it for that reason. It's just his reflections on what went on. And actually you get the sense of that, the apathy that even develops for those on the front, because they're in that situation all the time. And it did make me realise how, anything you see on the news really talking about warfare is probably hated by soldiers. Because these are people who have never been, making a dramatic story about it, all in their minds, for a public that's lapping it up, who then thinks they know something about what's going on and what it's like. They don't. And I do think, in that respect, this is a great book for helping us all to know our place in certain things. The fourth book that I read this month was linked to Goodbye to All That by Robert Graves, and it was, I don't know if you can see this, on Kindle, it was Storm of Steel by Ernst Junger. Now, Storm of Steel, Ernst Junger, is on the German side of the First World War. In fact, checking some of the places they fought, these two writers weren't all that far from each other at times. Ernst Junger, he describes the war quite graphically. It's a different way, and of course it's translated, but it's a different way to the way Robert Graves goes about it. One of the things that Junger does in Storm of Steel is he tries to help you grasp the sense that was instilled in the German youth about the glory of war and the honour of dying well, and how that made many, many young men sign up and come to the front to fight. You see between both of them the mutual respect that the British and the German soldiers had for each other. they saw each other as valiant foes. Now, of course, you had to also speak hatingly of each other while the war was on, and then, you know, insanely, ludicrously, as soon as the war's over, there's this amelioration societies that are set up to, you know, let's be pro-British if we're in Germany, and let's be pro-German if we're in Britain, after massacring millions of people. The hideousness and stupidity of war doesn't have come to the front when you read the accounts of two men who were in it on the opposite sides. What Younger does quite well, if someone wants to read very much about the battles, he does describe quite vividly. I mean, Graves was young when he went too, they're both about the same age, but he does describe quite vividly what it was like heading into his first attack. He describes how the shelling had been going on from the Germans, and they'd been given orders to go into the trenches and to push forward because a group of their battalion had already gone for a push and had got into the trenches of the French, it was, and they were to follow and keep the momentum going. And as he's going, he describes, you know, the sound of the shells ripping across the air, the explosion of trees, you know, noticing trees that are just levelled at a certain height because of the fire. He even talks about a man who is running and a shell blows up right in front of him and it throws him back and he just gets up and dusts himself off and carries on. And they said they were all, as young men, very impressed by this. But then it sort of sinks into him the horror at times of war, when they've finished one attack in particular. He goes off and is sort of sitting in the woods, reclining sort of in the sun, and then he notices like a person behind him, and it's a Frenchman, but the Frenchman's dead, and he's got his spectacles on, but he's got a green face because he's been dead a long time and wasn't buried. He talks about finding bodies when shells go off, or they've got into trenches, or the rain comes. He talks about that, the rain coming into the trenches and washing down some of the trench, and bodies that had been buried appearing, you know. But on top of just the description of war, he has got quite a psychological insight into himself, and into others, you know, barbarities that might be committed or claimed to have been committed by each side. Probably both of these agree that the British and the Germans were as good or as bad as each other. But obviously propagandists, who likely weren't in the fights themselves, were churning out all these lies to whip up hatred of the enemy. He describes village scenes ever so well. The frequency at which, when he's allowed to go back behind the lines and he just sits and he looks over some of the French villages which have had peace for centuries, and are just beautiful. And it seems so surreal to him that there are these flowers and there's birdsong. Birdsong comes up a lot in this book because despite the fact that some of the areas are completely wasted, the birds are still about. One of the characters that Ernst Junger mentions, which he finds, it's these little bits which make his work so bewildering in some respects and pathetic, is it mentions someone that was on good terms with both the British and the Germans and had the freedom to enter both of their trenches. It was a white cat. I think the cat might have been three-legged as well. And they would see the white cat go through no man's land, sometimes to the British trench, sometimes to the German trench. No one shot at it. We see the certain humanity at times when both sides get completely flooded by rainfall into their trenches to the point that they mutually agree to just hold the firing and get out onto no man's land, all of them, so that they can dig out their trenches and clean it and everything and get it livable so that they can climb back in and start killing each other again. And what I find interesting is, from the soldiers' perspective, that is not ludicrous, because they respect that these other men, the other side, are going through the same thing as them, and they're fighting for the same reason as them, for their love of country. But at the same time, it is horrendous and ludicrous in the sense that they're fighting because they've been told to by their powers at home, the governments, who won't relent. So they have to sort of make do with the situation. And they accept and sort of buy into a lot of the war, but have a deep, deep respect for one another. And the games that they play, you know, just seeing how they pass time. Most of a lot of Storm of Steel, as much as it's got the action bits and it's got some descriptions, a lot of it is spent, for this week we sat in a cellar, and he describes what the routine was in the cellar or in the trenches, sentry duty, and how to get to sleep. He describes the dugouts and how they're not big enough. Your feet would stick out the end of some of them and trip people up in the trenches. But what it does is it helps you. It's not a story like Barbuse's Under Fire, so from the French perspective, but that was done in novel form. These are written from the actual, undeniable and unapologetic opinion point of the writers who were there. And this is why these can be good classics, because you're not being asked your opinion on something, you're being told their view of what went on. And that's the closest thing you're going to get to the reality. What I got from pretty much both of them is what the media and what the government and the newspapers and all that tell people on both sides is never, never the reality. It's totally different for those who are involved in it. Now, this brings me back to the book, The Child of the Jago. I said I'd loop this back. It links to Goodbye to All That and Storm of Steel for a simple reason. Up until World War One, when armies were enlisted, when conscripts were gathered to go and fight, say in the Boer War in Africa or in the Crimea, which was, you know, a hellhole, people would be conscripted from the places like the Jago because they were subhuman, they were animalistic, they were brutes, no one cared about them. And so they were put into these horrors. What happened in World War One is the war knew no class divide up to the upper middle class. So the upper middle class, lower middle class, then the working classes, and then the absolute poor were all drafted into the war, all suffered. I mean, the high aristocracy, not so much, because they could get out. In fact, both of them talk about ones who get out of active duty because of who they know. Robert Graves has quite a sad story to tell regarding that. But it's interesting that, you know, all this time, there had been men going to the front, treated horribly, facing terrible things in their life, being brought home and being stuck back in complete abject poverty. But what was so awful about the war was the First World War was total war. It consumed the entire nation, you know, all industry had to be turned over to it. And men from all ranks had to go. They felt the obligation to go. It was just an outstanding sort of contrast that, you know what, people have been looked down upon and only when it touches home do people care. And that's one of the reasons the First World War was so awful, was because no one got left. Nearly every family was touched. It wasn't just these poor people who didn't matter. So I would say actually all four books are good to read that I read this month. If there was one I would recommend less out of them, that would probably be Ernst Younger's Storm of Steel. I don't think he executed it as well as Robert Graves did, but it's still very worth reading if you're interested in that. Now, just regarding the First World War, I was wondering whether you on YouTube would like to, or you'd like me to get in touch with some other YouTubers and set up sort of a particular read-along. World War November, being as November was when the armistice was signed, the 11th of the 11th, maybe I could set something up with some other YouTubers to read some biographies based in World War One, or stories set there, and anyone else that wants to come read along with us, and then there'll be a big chat at the end. How does that sound to you? Would you like me to go about setting that up with some on YouTube for November? So that's what I read this August. Tell me which ones appeal to you, which ones do you like the sound of, have you read any of them, and what were your thoughts? And until the next time I wish you joy in your reading.